One half in the dust-blown town of Alder Creek, where every heartbeat seemed to echo against the silent mountains and every shadow felt like it carried someone's secret. 23-year-old Clara May Holden stood outside the crooked door of the sheriff's office, trembling so hard her hands wouldn't stay still. The midday sun seared the back of her neck, but she didn't notice, her mind consumed by only one thought: her baby, her sweet James, only 8 months old, taken from her arms that morning by the ruthless debt collector Silas Grieve, a man whose heart was darker than the coal seams he owned up in the hills. She had begged him, pleaded until her voice cracked, but Silas, tall and cold and smug in his dustless black coat, had simply smirked and told her that debt was debt, and if she couldn't pay him back the $100 her late father owed, then her child would work it off in his mining camp when he was old enough, and until then he'd be held as collateral, an ugly word Clara had never heard but could feel through her bones. She tried the sheriff, but Sheriff Dobbs barely looked up from his stale coffee, muttering something about lawful contracts and Grieve owns half the town, before telling her to calm down and stop causing a scene. But Clara knew if she didn't cause a scene now, she'd never see her baby again. The town watched her with that uncomfortable pity people give only when they're too afraid to help, and Clara felt more alone than she had ever felt in all the years since her mother died. Her only hope, a foolish, desperate hope, was that maybe, just maybe, someone would ride through Alder Creek today who wasn't afraid of Silas Grieve. And as if fate had been listening from behind the clouds, at exactly noon, when the town bell gave its single metallic groan, a rider appeared along the shimmering heat line of the horizon, a man on a massive roan horse, broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, with a slow, certain way of moving as though he feared nothing and answered to no one. People paused mid-step, mid-conversation, because they recognized that walk even from a distance, the wild confidence of someone who belonged to the mountains, not the town, a trapper, a tracker, maybe even one of those ghost-rumored mountain men who wandered the high ridges alone. Clara watched as he rode straight into town and stopped his horse right in front of the sheriff's office, where she stood swallowing tears. The stranger dismounted with a calm that unsettled everyone around, brushed dust from his coat, and finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, eyes the color of stormwater, tired yet sharp, eyes that made Clara's heart jolt as though her body suddenly remembered what hope felt like. "Ma'am," he said in a voice low and steady, "you look like someone who's just been robbed." She tried to speak but the words broke apart in her throat, so she simply nodded, pressing both hands to her chest. "They took my baby," she whispered, and as she said it, the weight of the morning slammed into her again and her knees buckled, but the man caught her by the elbows with surprising gentleness. He didn't react with shock or pity or awkward silence, only a quiet tightening of his jaw. "Who?" he asked, and Clara felt a strange sense of safety in the simplicity of the question. "Silas Grieve," she answered, and the stranger's expression hardened like iron cooling. The sheriff stepped out then, clearing his throat uneasily, trying to warn the mountain man that Alder Creek wasn't the kind of place where strangers did heroics, but the stranger, who introduced himself only as Rowan Hale, barely acknowledged him. Instead, he asked Clara to tell him everything, and she did, spilling out the story of her father's debt, Silas's threats, the way he ripped James from her arms while the entire street pretended not to see. Rowan listened without interrupting, his face unreadable except for a flicker of anger that seemed to deepen every time Silas's name was mentioned. When Clara finished, Rowan looked at the sheriff and said, "You know this ain't right." Sheriff Dobbs shrugged, muttering again about contracts and Grieve's power, but Rowan stepped closer until their faces were inches apart and said quietly, "There's law, and there's what a man will or won't tolerate." Then, without another word, he turned to Clara and asked where Grieve was keeping the baby. She hesitated. The mining camp was 10 miles north, up a steep trail, guarded by men even the sheriff avoided, but Rowan seemed undeterred, almost calm, as if he had already decided nothing would stop him. Clara begged him not to go alone, not to risk himself for someone he didn't know, but he only shook his head and said, "Ma'am, there are some things a man don't walk away from." And so he went, riding into the rising heat of the mountains with a purpose that sent whispers through every street of Alder Creek. Clara waited in town, pacing, praying, feeling the minutes drag like chains. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long, and the fear in her chest coiled tighter until she could barely breathe. Near dusk, a rider galloped into town screaming that shots had been heard near the mine, that Grief's men were scrambling, and Clara felt her stomach twist. What if Rowan had been killed for her sake? What if she had sent a stranger to die? But just as panic threatened to swallow her, another sound cut through the murmurs, a slow, deliberate series of hoofbeats. The town turned. And there he was. Rowan Hale, riding back into Alder Creek with the same calm confidence he'd arrived with, only now he held a bundled baby against his chest, wrapped in a blanket Clara recognized at once, James's. Clara ran, stumbling, crying, reaching, and Rowan held out her baby with a tenderness that didn't match his rugged, battle-scarred hands. James whimpered and then burst into sobs the moment he felt her arms, and Clara collapsed against Rowan, shaking with relief, clutching her child so tightly she feared she might break him. Rowan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she noticed he was bleeding along his left arm, the result of a gunfight he tried to downplay. Just a scratch, he muttered, though Clara could see the ripped sleeve and streak of red. She tried to ask what happened, but Rowan only said, "Grieve won't be bothering you anymore," with a tone so final the entire town froze. Whether Silas fled or fell, nobody dared to question. Sheriff Dobbs, red-faced and ashamed, shuffled forward to offer help, but Rowan ignored him, turning instead to Clara, who was still holding James as though afraid he might vanish. "You and your boy are safe now," he said softly, and though Clara opened her mouth to thank him, the words weren't enough. Nothing she could say felt big enough to match what he had done. Rowan only nodded, as if understanding, then walked toward his horse with the intention of disappearing back into the mountains, but Clara stopped him with a trembling hand. "Please," she said, her voice raw, "stay, just for supper, or the night, or—" Her courage failed, but Rowan looked at her in a way that made the air tremble, as if he understood the unspoken fear she carried, that men come and go, that promises vanish, that heroes don't stay. He hesitated. Then, for the first time, he smiled, small, tired, but real. "Maybe I'll stay till morning," he said, "just to be sure no trouble comes knocking." Clara felt something in her chest shift, a small but undeniable bloom of hope. And as the townsfolk watched, whispering about the woman whose baby was stolen and the mountain man who rode at noon to get him back, Clara walked beside Rowan toward the tiny cabin where her life had begun to fall apart, and now, maybe, where something new could begin. And for every viewer listening to this story, if you want more tales of courage, justice, and people who dare to fight for what matters most, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because your support helps bring powerful stories like this to life and keeps this journey going stronger than ever.